Mara Ashford stood in front of the yogurt. There were 43 varieties. She had counted them once months ago in a fit of half-serious curiosity, and the number had lodged itself in her mind the way a splinter lodges beneath skin, invisible until pressed. Greek, Icelandic, French style, non-dairy, low-fat, full-fat, protein-boosted, probiotic, organic, plant-based, cultured, strained. Some came in glass jars meant to be reused as tumblers, a small architecture of guilt built into the packaging. Throw this away and you have wasted not just yogurt but design, intention, the labor of someone who believed a jar could be beautiful enough to survive its contents. She was 34 years old. She had a graduate degree, a job that paid enough to make rent without anxiety, a body that mostly did what she asked of it, and she could not decide on a Tuesday evening which yogurt to buy. This was not, she understood intellectually, a crisis. It was a Tuesday. It was yogurt. But she had noticed, over the last several years, that the paralysis was not confined to yogurt. It showed up in restaurant menus that ran to 4 laminated pages. It showed up in the 14 tabs she kept open comparing health insurance plans, each with its own deductible and network and fine print, until the comparing itself became a second job she never got paid for. It showed up most seriously in the 3 folders on her desktop, one labeled Stay, one labeled Portland, one labeled the name of a man, Daniel, that she had not opened in 9 days because opening them meant she would have to choose among them, and choosing meant that the other 2 folders would close, possibly forever, and she found that unbearable in a way she could not fully explain to anyone, including herself. She bought the plain Greek yogurt, the same one she had bought for 6 years, not because she had decided it was best but because deciding was too expensive and habit was free. At home, she ate standing at the counter and scrolled through her phone with the specific hunger of someone looking for permission. A friend had once told her, half joking, that she suffered from an abundance problem, not a scarcity one, that she had more good options than any person in human history had ever had at once, and that this, paradoxically, was making her miserable. Mara had laughed at the time. She was laughing less now. She had read, a year earlier, a book by a psychologist named Barry Schwartz, borrowed from a co-worker and never returned, its spine now soft and its pages underlined in 3 different colors of ink because she kept reading it and forgetting what she'd already marked. Schwartz's argument was almost insultingly simple once you saw it, that a certain amount of choice is liberating, but that past a threshold, more choice does not continue to liberate. It begins, instead, to paralyze. And even when it does not paralyze, even when a choice gets made, it tends to leave the chooser less satisfied than she would have been with fewer options, because now she is haunted by the ghosts of what she didn't pick. Schwartz had a term for it, drawn from earlier research: opportunity cost. Every option you select comes bundled invisibly with every option you rejected, and the rejected options do not vanish. They linger at the edge of the decision like guests who were not quite uninvited, murmuring about how things might have gone. There was a second concept in the book that had lodged even deeper than the first, the distinction between maximizers and satisficers. A satisficer, Schwartz explained, is someone who has a set of criteria and picks the first option that meets them, good enough, and done. A maximizer is someone who must be certain she has selected the best possible option, which requires her, in principle, to examine every option, or as many as time and sanity allow, and this pursuit of the optimal tends to produce not confidence but its opposite. Maximizers, according to the studies Schwartz cited, ended up with objectively better outcomes on average, better jobs, marginally higher salaries, and were reliably less happy about it than satisficers who'd settled for good enough. The maximizer's mind kept the tab open. It kept comparing, indefinitely, against alternatives that no longer even existed. Mara had read this section on a train and had to put the book down and look out the window for a while, because she recognized herself in it with an accuracy that felt almost hostile. She had always thought of her carefulness as a virtue, due diligence, thoroughness, the responsible instinct to not act rashly. It had not occurred to her until Schwartz put the word next to her behavior that thoroughness could itself be a trap, a way of mistaking research for progress, motion for movement. The 3 folders on her desktop had been there for 9 days. Stay meant the promotion she'd been offered at the publishing house, a real one with a real title, Director of Acquisitions, the kind of job she had been quietly angling towards since she was 26, in a city she knew the way you know a person you've lived with a long time, comfortably, without any remaining surprises, which was either the best or worst thing you could say about a place. Portland meant a smaller job at a smaller press, less money, a notion of open, undefined future, and the particular electricity of not knowing anyone in a new city, which some version of her, a younger and hungrier version, might have called freedom. Daniel meant nothing so tidy as a job title. Daniel meant a man she had been seeing for 11 months who had 3 weeks ago said the sentence she had been both wanting and dreading to hear, "I think I want to build something real with you, and I need to know if that's what you want to," and who was infuriatingly entirely compatible with either of the other 2 folders, which meant he did not simplify the decision so much as multiply it. Stay with Daniel. Portland without Daniel. Portland and ask Daniel to come. Stay and see what happens. Each branch generating further branches, a decision tree with no trunk, and Mara standing at its base with an axe she could not bring herself to swing, because swinging it would fell all the other branches with it. She had read somewhere, she thought it might have been Schwartz again, or someone he cited, that the human brain evolved to make choices in an environment of profound scarcity. For most of human history, the number of life options available to an ordinary person on an ordinary day was small: which direction to walk, which berries to eat, whether to trust the stranger at the fire. The machinery of decision-making, the part of the mind that weighs and regrets and revisits, had been built for that world, a world of few doors. It had not been built for 43 yogurts, or 14 insurance tabs, or a decision tree with 3 trunks each splitting into 3 more. Mara rinsed the yogurt container and set it in the recycling and stood for a moment in her kitchen, which she had lived in for 4 years and might, in a matter of weeks, not live in at all, and she thought, not for the first time, that there was something almost funny about it, if you could get enough distance to laugh. She had more freedom than almost any woman in the history of the species. She could live in either coast. She could have a serious partner or no partner. She could have a corner office or a folding chair in a shared warehouse space with exposed brick and cold coffee. Nothing was closing a door on her. And it was exactly this, the absence of any door closing, the total openness of it, that had her standing at a kitchen counter at 9 at night, unable to move. She did not know yet that a man across an ocean and 80 years earlier had discovered something adjacent to this feeling under circumstances so different from hers that the comparison would seem, on its face, obscene. A man who had almost no choices left, who lived under curfew and censorship and the daily proximity of violence, and who had concluded, from the wreckage of that constraint, that freedom was not a pleasant fact about human beings but a heavy one. That we do not merely have freedom. We are condemned to it. Mara turned off the kitchen light and went to sit with the 3 unopened folders, and did not open them, and went to bed instead, which was its own kind of choice, the choice to not choose, though she would not have called it that, not yet. In the winter of 1940, a heavyset, wall-eyed philosophy teacher named Jean-Paul Sartre was a prisoner of war in a camp near Trier, on the German side of the border, sleeping in a converted barn with men who had, until recently, been his fellow soldiers in a French army that had collapsed with an almost surreal speed. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The army Sartre served in, he had been a meteorologist of all things, releasing weather balloons near the Maginot Line, a posting so far from combat that he later admitted he had barely understood the war was happening until it was already lost, had simply come apart, and Sartre found himself marched east with tens of thousands of others into a stalag, a number stamped where his name had been. It should have been, by any ordinary reckoning, the least free period of his life. He could not choose where he slept, what he ate, when he woke, whether he could write a letter or receive one. And yet it was here, in the barn near Trier, borrowing paper from a friendly priest and reading whatever books came through the camp's meagre library, Heidegger most of all, whom he read now with the leisure that only captivity could provide, that Sartre began to sketch the ideas that would become his enormous, difficult book, A Letter et la Néant, Being and Nothingness. He gave lectures to fellow prisoners on Heidegger by candlelight. He wrote a Christmas play for them, performed in the camp, about a man visited by ghosts, and one of the prisoners who watched it later said that for 2 hours, inside a barn behind barbed wire, none of them had felt like prisoners at all. Sartre was released in 1941 on a medical discharge. His blind, wandering right eye, the result of a childhood illness, was judged to make him unfit for further military use, though some later biographers suspected he had forged or embellished the paperwork, eager simply to get out. He returned to a Paris that was no longer the Paris he had left. It was occupied. German soldiers walked the boulevards. Curfew emptied the streets by night. The newspapers were censored, the radio was censored. A Jewish colleague of his at the lycée where he taught had been dismissed under the new racial laws, and Sartre, notably, had accepted the vacated teaching post, a fact he did not advertise later in life, and one that sits uneasily inside the story of a man who would soon become, in the eyes of many, the philosopher of freedom. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of the timing. Here was a country with almost no political freedom left. You could not speak freely. You could not publish freely, not without threading your words past a censor who might send you to prison, or worse, for the wrong sentence. You could not move freely between zones without papers. An entire population had had its external freedom stripped down to something close to zero, and had learned, the way water learns the shape of whatever contains it, to live inside these narrowed channels. And it was into this narrowing, and not into some sunlit era of open horizons, that Sartre delivered the argument for which he is still best remembered, that human beings are not merely free in the sense of possessing a pleasant option here and there, but that we are, in his phrase, condemned to be free, condamné à être libre. He meant something specific and, on first encounter, almost cruel. Sartre's claim was that human existence has no fixed essence handed down in advance, no blueprint, no God-given nature, no script that tells a person what she is for. A letter opener, to use his own example, is made by a craftsman who already knows, before the first cut of metal, what the object is for. It exists to open letters, and its essence, its purpose precedes its existence. A human being, Sartre argued, is not like this. We are thrown into existence first, without a manual, and only afterward, through what we do we construct anything like an essence, a self, a set of values. Existence precedes essence. And because there is no author standing behind us guaranteeing our nature or our choices, every single thing a person does is, in the fullest sense, her own responsibility, not chosen by her circumstances, not excused by her upbringing, not authored by God or fate or the stars, but chosen freshly by her in this moment, and the next, and the next. This is where the word condemned earns its weight. We did not ask to be free in this way. Sartre was careful to say that freedom, in his sense, was not something a person achieved through effort or earned through virtue. It was simply the basic condition of being a conscious human creature, inescapable, present even in the choice to appear as though one had no choice. You cannot resign from freedom. Even declining to decide is itself a decision, made freely, for which you remain answerable. A man on a train platform who lets 3 trains pass because he cannot bring himself to choose a destination has, in Sartre's accounting, chosen. He has chosen to stand still, and he alone bears the weight of that. There is no place to set the burden down. This is the condemnation, not that freedom is denied us, but that it is inflicted on us, total and unrelenting, whether or not we want it, whether or not we feel ready to carry it. And the feeling that accompanies the full recognition of this condition, Sartre argued, is not lightness. It is anguish, a word he borrowed and reworked from Kierkegaard, who had used it a century earlier to describe the vertigo a man feels standing at the edge of a cliff, not from fear of falling, but from the terrible awareness that nothing is stopping him from jumping except his own will, moment to moment, and that this will could, in principle, fail at any instant. Anguish for Sartre was the recognition that no value, no commandment, no external law could make a choice for you. You could consult every ethical system ever devised, every priest, every parent, every philosopher, and in the end, the choosing was still yours alone, uncushioned, unwitnessed by any court higher than your own conscience, because for Sartre there was no higher court. If God did not exist, as he was fond of putting it, then everything was permitted, and this was the harder half of the sentence, the half people tended to forget. Everything was also, therefore, entirely our responsibility. He told a story, later, in a public lecture that would become the pamphlet Existentialism is a Humanism, about a student who had come to see him during the occupation. The young man's brother had been killed by the Germans in 1940. He lived alone with his mother, who had already lost one son and who, in Sartre's account, lived for him. He was, in a real sense, all she had left to hold on to in a devastated world. The student wanted to leave, to cross into England or into unoccupied territory and join the Free French forces fighting to liberate the country. It was, on its face, the more heroic path. The path of national duty, of vengeance for his brother, of joining a cause larger than himself. But leaving meant abandoning his mother, perhaps forever, perhaps to a grief that would break her entirely, with no one there to carry her through it. Staying meant a narrower, quieter form of care, certain in its effect but small in its scope, one woman, sustained, while a country burned. The student came to Sartre, he said, precisely because he had run out of doctrines that could decide it for him. Christian ethics told him to love his neighbor, but which neighbor, the one in front of him or the abstraction of the nation? Kantian ethics told him to act only according to maxims he could rule as universal law, but he could construct a universal maxim to defend either choice with equal ease. He could ask an older, wiser man what to do, Sartre said, but choosing which adviser to trust, choosing whose voice to obey, was already itself an act of unaided choice, because the young man had to decide, before ever hearing the advice, whether this adviser was the kind of man whose word he should follow, and that decision could not be handed to anyone else either. There was, Sartre said, no sign in the world telling him which path was correct. There was only the young man, alone at the base of two roads, and the choosing, however he made it, would be entirely his, and it would define, retroactively, the kind of man he was. Sartre did not tell the audience what advice he gave the student that day. He said only, "You are free, therefore choose, that is to say, invent. No signs are vouchsafed in this world." He wanted his listeners to feel the coldness of that sentence and the freedom hidden inside it at once, because for Sartre these were not two different things. The condemnation and the liberty were the same facts, seen from two angles, the way a coin does not have a good side and a bad side so much as one side and another, both equally the coin. It was a strange doctrine to emerge from an occupied city. And yet perhaps it was not so strange after all. Perhaps it could only have emerged there, in a place where every external structure of certainty had been stripped away by force, where the law was the enemy's law and the old moral order had visibly failed to prevent catastrophe, and where a person walking home past curfew had to decide, without any handbook, what kind of person she was going to be under conditions no handbook had anticipated. In scarcity of every material kind, Sartre found an unbearable abundance of a different kind, the abundance of having to decide alone, without cover, again and again, what one's life would mean. Mara Ashford, on the other side of the world, and the better part of a century later, was drowning in the opposite condition, a superabundance of everything except the courage to choose among it. But it was, underneath the very different textures of the two lives, the same coin. By the 10th day, Mara had built herself a spreadsheet. It had 6 tabs. One for salary comparisons, adjusted for cost of living, with a formula she had found online and did not fully trust. One for a pro and con list about Daniel that had grown so long she'd had to shrink the font twice. One that simply tracked with dates every time she had changed her mind, which by that point numbered 11 distinct reversals in 9 days, a chart that when she finally graphed it looked less like a decision-making process and more like the readout of a seismograph during a minor, persistent earthquake. She had gone, on day 7, to see her old graduate advisor, a woman named Professor Okonkwo Reyes, who had once run a small experimental psychology lab and now, in her emeritus years, mostly gardened and consulted for a non-profit, but who still had the particular gift of listening to a problem the way a good mechanic listens to an engine for the sound beneath the sound. "You're describing decision fatigue," the professor said, over tea, after Mara had laid out the spreadsheet, the folders, the 11 reversals. "It's a real, measurable phenomenon. There's a famous study, you may have heard of it, of parole board judges in Israel. Researchers tracked the rulings these judges made across a full day, and they found something that should trouble anyone who believes justice is purely a matter of law and evidence. Early in the morning, right after a food break, the judges granted parole in something like 65% of cases. By the time they'd been making decisions for a couple of hours with no break, that number had fallen close to 0. Then they'd eat again, and the rate would jump right back up to something near 65% before beginning its slow decline all over again. The severity of the crime didn't shift in any pattern that neat. The law didn't change over lunch. What changed was the judge's capacity to keep exercising judgment. Every decision, it turns out, draws down the same limited reservoir, whether the decision is about a man's freedom or about which brand of paperclip to buy. And when the reservoir runs low, the mind reaches for the easiest available option, which in a parole hearing means simply refusing the status quo, the path that requires no further deliberation. Mara thought of the 11 reversals and wondered how many of them had really been reasoning and how many had simply been the sound of an empty tank refilling itself with whichever answer happened to be loudest in a given hour. There's a related idea you might find useful or might find upsetting depending on the week, the professor went on. A psychologist named Barry Schwartz, I think you mentioned reading him, draws a distinction between two temperaments in the way people approach decisions. He calls them maximizers and satisficers. The terms actually predate him. They come out of Herbert Simon's work on bounded rationality back in the 50s, but Schwartz is the one who really popularized the emotional consequences. A satisficer sets a threshold, this is what I need, this is good enough, and takes the first option that clears the bar. A maximizer needs to be sure she has found the best option among all realistically available options, which in practice means she keeps searching, keeps comparing, keeps a small mental tab open on every road not taken, sometimes for years afterward. "That's me," Mara said, and hated how quickly she said it. "It usually is for people who come find me with spreadsheets," the professor said, not unkindly. "The maximizer isn't lazy or foolish, quite the opposite. Maximizers in these studies often do end up, on paper, with better outcomes. Higher salaries out of college, marginally so. Better material terms. But when you survey them afterward about how they feel about the outcome, they report less satisfaction, more regret, and more of what the literature calls counterfactual thinking, replaying the alternatives, wondering. It isn't that they made worse choices. It's that having access to more alternatives generates more grief over the alternatives foregone, and that grief doesn't shut off just because a decision technically got made. Schwartz has a phrase for it I like: the more options there are, the easier it is to regret anything at all that is disappointing about the option you chose, because you can construct in your mind a hypothetical alternative that wouldn't have had that particular flaw. With only 2 sweaters to choose from, you might tell yourself, well, the other one probably had its own problems too. With 400 sweaters, that consolation disappears. Somewhere in there is a sweater without any flaws, and you have simply failed to find it. Mara thought about the 3 folders, about how, if she chose Portland, some version of herself would spend the next 5 years wondering about the version who stayed and took the directorship. If she chose to stay, some other version would wonder every time she passed a certain kind of bookstore whether the smaller press in the smaller city might have made her a different, freer, more essential kind of editor. There was no configuration of the decision tree that did not leave a ghost standing at its edge. "Here's the part that I think people miss," Professor Conquerez said, setting down her cup. "Schwartz isn't arguing that choice is bad. He's arguing that there's a curve. A small number of options increases satisfaction and a sense of agency sharply, and then at some point the curve bends and additional choice starts to produce the opposite effect. It doesn't feel like abundance past that point. It feels like a burden with no edges." There's an experiment he cites done by 2 other researchers, Iyengar and Lepper, at a grocery store. They set up a tasting table for jam, sometimes with 6 varieties, sometimes with 24. The big display drew more people over to look. It's more exciting, more options, more color. But when it came time to actually buy, the people at the small display were roughly 10 times more likely to make a purchase than the people at the large one. The abundance drew the crowd and then dissolved their will to act. It's a strange kind of trap, and it doesn't announce itself as a trap. It feels, the whole time, like you're simply being careful. Mara went home that night and did not open the spreadsheet. She sat on the floor of her living room instead, back against the couch, and thought about the 24 jams and the 6 that outsold them, and wondered, with something that felt uncomfortably close to grief, whether the honest and glamorous truth of her situation was simply this, that she had too much, and that having too much had begun to function in her nervous system indistinguishably from having too little. The body did not seem to know the difference between a door that would not open and 100 doors that all, terrifyingly, would. There was a night around this time when she dreamed or half-dreamed in the thin, unreliable way of falling asleep with the television still murmuring in the next room of a hallway lined with doors, more doors than she could count, each one slightly ajar, each one leaking a different quality of light into the corridor, gold from one, blue from another, a warm flickering orange from a third. In the dream she walked the length of the hallway for what felt like hours, pausing at each door, reaching for each handle, and pulling her hand back every time, because behind her, the doors she'd already passed had begun, very quietly, to close. She woke with her heart going hard and lay in the dark doing the thing Schwartz's book had warned her about without quite naming it as such, morning doors she had not yet even failed to walk through. There is a passage in Being and Nothingness that Sartre's readers have returned to for 80 years, not because it is his most technical, but because it is his most visible, a single image that makes the whole apparatus of his philosophy suddenly legible to anyone who has ever sat in a cafe and watched the staff move between tables. Sartre describes a waiter. The man's movements, he notices, are a little too precise, a little too quick. He bends toward the customer with an eagerness that is a shade too pronounced. He carries the tray with an arm held a fraction too rigid, balancing it the way a tightrope walker balances a pole, an exaggerated equilibrium that draws attention to itself as performance. He is, Sartre writes, playing at being a waiter, not simply working as one, the way a stone simply is a stone, but performing waiterness, inhabiting the role the way an actor inhabits a part, with a stylization that reveals the whole thing to be, in some sense, a game. A game the waiter is not merely playing but is aware, on some level, of playing. Sartre's point was not that the waiter was doing anything unusual or dishonest in any ordinary sense. His point was that the waiter had located, in the ritual and precision of his role, an escape from the unbearable openness of being a free consciousness with no fixed nature at all. To be a waiter, fully and only a waiter, the way an inkwell is fully and only an inkwell, would be a kind of relief. It would mean the terrifying question of what to do next and what it means, and who is responsible for the meaning, had been answered in advance by the role itself. But human consciousness cannot actually collapse into an object that way. A person is never simply identical to her job, her role, her label, the way a chair is identical to being a chair. There is always a gap, however thin, between what one is and what one does, and inside that gap lies the whole unbearable freedom Sartre had spent the occupation trying to describe. The waiter who plays at being a waiter is using the performance to paper over that gap to convince himself and everyone watching that no gap exists, that he simply is this role chosen for him, requiring no further choosing. Sartre called this mauvaise foi, bad faith, the practice of fleeing from one's own freedom by pretending to oneself that one has no freedom to flee from. Bad faith takes many forms in his writing. There is the young woman on a first date who, when a man takes her hand, leaves her hand resting in his without either withdrawing it or acknowledging what the gesture means, allowing herself to exist for a while as pure disembodied conversation, a mind floating serenely above a hand she has for the moment declined to claim as her responsibility. There is the man who tells himself he is a coward by nature, as though cowardice were a fixed mineral fact about him, like the color of his eyes, rather than something he has chosen moment after moment, and could in the next moment choose differently. Bad faith, in every case Sartre gives, is the attempt to become a thing solid, fixed, excused, rather than remain what one actually and inescapably is, a freedom, unfinished, answerable, with no flaw beneath it but the next choice. It would be too easy, and probably too flattering to Mara, to say that she was practicing bad faith in any grand Sartrean sense when she rinsed out the yogurt container and went to bed instead of opening the folders. But the shape was there unmistakably, if you looked at it from the right angle. Habit in Mara's life had become something close to what the waiter's stylized tray carrying was for Sartre, a way of behaving as though the choice had already been made, as though she were simply a person who buys the plain Greek yogurt, simply a person who has not yet decided, simply a person for whom 9 days is a reasonable interval to let pass before opening a folder, as though these facts about herself were discovered rather than chosen, found rather than authored, and therefore not, in the end, entirely her fault. She noticed it most clearly at work. There was a meeting on day 12 in which her boss, a warm, tired man named Alvaro, who had given her the offer and who liked her enough to be visibly uncomfortable about pressuring her, asked gently whether she'd had a chance to think it over. And Mara heard herself say, "I'm still weighing a few things," in a tone so smooth and practiced that she recognized it with a small jolt as a line she had now used 4 separate times to 4 separate people, a line that had stopped being a report on her internal state and had become, instead, a small performance of a woman who was thoughtfully weighing things, a costume she could put on that let her postpone for one more day the moment when weighing would have to end and choosing would have to begin. The costume was comfortable. That was the trouble with it. It did not feel like avoidance from the inside. It felt like diligence, like the responsible thing, like the version of herself she had always been proud of, careful, unhurried, unwilling to be rushed into a decision as large as this one. Sartre would have recognized the maneuver instantly because he had described, in his account of the waiter, exactly this kind of comfortable disappearance into a role. The woman who is carefully weighing things was, in its own quiet register, no less a performance than the waiter's too precise tray carrying, and it served the identical function. It let Mara exist for another day in a kind of suspended, unauthored state, where the responsibility for what came next belonged to some future version of her who had, mysteriously, finished weighing, a version who did not yet exist and could not, therefore, be blamed for anything that had not yet happened. But Sartre's whole point, driven home again and again across hundreds of pages, was that there was no such version waiting in the wings to relieve her of the job. There was only Mara, now, choosing, in the only currency that ever actually gets spent, this day, this hour, this decision either made or, and this was the part that stung, once she let herself feel its full weight, not made, which was, itself, a choice dressed up as the absence of one. Every day she let the folders sit closed was a vote for stay, cast not by conviction but by inertia, and inertia, Sartre would have insisted, still belonged to her. There was no neutral party administering the default. She was the default. She thought of the young man in Sartre's story again, the one weighing his mother's grief against his brother's memory, weighing an abstract nation against one concrete, aging, devoted woman down the hall, and understood, with something like envy, that at least his agony had been visible to him as agony. He had known he was suffering the full weight of an unaided choice, had gone looking for someone to lift it, and found, in Sartre, only a mirror held up to his own freedom. Mara's agony had been dressed in a costume of reasonableness for so long that she had nearly missed it being agony at all. She had called it prudence. She had called it not rushing things. It had taken a stranger's philosophy, written in a besieged city 80 years before she was born, to show her the waiter inside her own reflection, carrying a tray a little too carefully, playing at being a woman who simply hadn't decided yet, as though such a woman could exist independently of the decision she kept declining, hour after hour, to make. Daniel called on the 14th day, not to pressure her, he was careful to say, but because he had promised himself he would ask once, honestly, how she was doing, and then let the question rest. They sat on the low wall outside her building, the kind of evening in early autumn when the air still remembers summer but the light has already started giving up early, going amber and thin by 7. Daniel had a way of waiting that Mara had always found remarkable in him, not the anxious waiting of someone counting the seconds until you finish a thought, but a genuine, spacious patience, as though he trusted that whatever she eventually said would be worth the interval. It was, she sometimes thought, one of the things that made her afraid of losing him, and one of the things that made the decision feel so unfairly weighted, because how were you supposed to build a spreadsheet cell for a person's patience? I keep thinking there's a version of this where I don't have to choose, she said finally, where I get some kind of sign, or where enough time passes that one of the doors just closes on its own, and then I'm not the one who closed it. Has that ever actually worked? Daniel asked, not unkindly, in your experience of your own life. She laughed, a short, unhappy sound. No. It just becomes a different kind of choosing. The waiting is the choosing. I know that. I've been reading a book that says exactly that, actually, in language a lot more depressing than yours. Tell me. So she told him about Sartre, about the waiter and his tray, about the young man who came to a philosopher during a war looking for an answer and left with a mirror instead. She told him about the folders, about the fact that she was, in effect, choosing stay every single day she failed to open the other two, and that she had somehow convinced herself this ongoing, silent choosing did not count, as though a vote only mattered if it was cast out loud. That sounds unbearable, Daniel said. The idea that there's no one to blame. No fate, no bad luck, no parents who set it up this way. Just you deciding over and over, with nothing underneath you. It is unbearable, Mara said. I think that might be the point. I think he wanted it to be unbearable. He has this word for it, anguish, not fear exactly, more like the feeling you'd have standing at the edge of a very tall building, not because you're afraid of falling, but because you suddenly notice that nothing except your own will is keeping you from jumping. Nothing external, no railing thick enough. It's all you, all the way down. And the choice you're facing feels like that. It feels like that constantly. Every option is fine. That's the horror of it, Daniel. If one of them were obviously wrong, I'd have been done in an afternoon. But Portland is good. Staying is good. You're good. She said this last part and immediately regretted how clinical it sounded, an item checked off a list rather than a truth about a man she had, more than once, imagined a whole unplanned life beside. I don't mean it like that. I mean the problem was never that I had a bad option in the mix. The problem is I have 3 good ones, and I can't make peace with the fact that choosing any of them means actively, permanently losing the other 2. Not maybe losing them. Definitely. On purpose. By my own hand. Daniel was quiet for a moment, turning something over. There's a thing my grandmother used to say, badly translated, something like, a person who waits for the perfect road has already chosen to walk nowhere. I always thought it was a little glib. I think I understand it better now, hearing you talk about all this. It's the same thing the psychologist says, more or less, minus the aphorism, Mara said. He calls it maximizing, needing to be sure you found the best of everything before you commit to any of it. And the punchline, this is the part I keep circling back to at 2 in the morning, is that maximizers don't even end up happier. Even when they do get the objectively better outcome, they are haunted worse than everyone else because they had more alternatives to grieve. So what does he say to do about it? The psychologist. He talks about becoming what he calls a satisficer instead, deciding what you actually need, what would genuinely be enough, and then taking the first thing that clears that bar and refusing to keep shopping afterward. Not settling, exactly, he's careful about that word, but drawing a line around the search itself. Saying past this point, more comparison isn't wisdom anymore, it's just a more elegant form of avoidance. Does that feel true to you? Mara looked out at the street, at a woman walking a dog who seemed to know exactly where she was going, no hesitation in her stride at all, and felt a small, unreasonable envy toward her. I think it's true, and I think it's the hardest true thing I've ever had to actually do something about. Knowing the shape of the trap doesn't get you out of the trap. I've read the whole book. I could probably teach a seminar on decision fatigue at this point. And I still went to bed last night without opening a single folder. What would it take, Daniel asked, to open them? It was such a plain question that it nearly undid her. Not what should you choose, not what do I want you to choose, just the mechanical, almost childlike question of what would need to be true for her hand to actually move toward the trackpad, the folder, the decision. She realized, sitting there, that she had spent 2 weeks constructing an elaborate intellectual architecture around the problem, Schwartz's curves and Sartre's anguish and the parole judges and the jam, and that all of it, however illuminating, had functioned in practice as one more form of the waiter's tray, one more sophisticated way of looking extremely busy with a decision instead of making one. She had been reading about freedom instead of exercising it. There was a difference, she now saw, embarrassingly large and embarrassingly late, between understanding a cage with total clarity and walking out of it. I don't think it takes anything, she said slowly, working it out as she said it. I think that's actually the whole insight, and I've been avoiding the plain version of it because the plain version has no more research to hide behind. There isn't a piece of information I'm missing. There isn't a sign coming. Sartre says that explicitly, no signs are vouchsafed in this world. Nobody is going to hand me a folder with a gold star on it. At some point the only thing separating me from a decision is a decision, and everything else, the spreadsheet, the pro-con list, this conversation, probably is just me finding increasingly respectable ways to stand at the edge a little longer. Daniel didn't try to talk her out of the discomfort of that, which she was grateful for. Later, when she thought back on the conversation, he just nodded and said, "For what it's worth, whatever you choose, I don't think it makes you a different kind of person than the one I've spent 11 months with. I think you're going to be exactly as capable and exactly as anxious and exactly as thorough about the grocery store either way. The choice doesn't manufacture you. You're already there, underneath all 3 folders, same as you'd be underneath any of them." She went upstairs that night not with an answer, but with something that felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, like the outline of one, the sense that the fog she'd been standing in was not, in fact, a fog of insufficient information, waiting to be cleared by one more data point, one more comparison, one more spreadsheet tab. It was a fog she herself was generating continuously by the act of refusing to step forward, the way breath fogs a window and then blames the window for being unclear. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop and let the cursor hover for a long moment over the icon labeled stay, not clicking it, not yet, but no longer, for the first time in 14 days, looking away from it either. Sartre never intended anguish to be the final word. He was, for all the bleakness that clung to the word existentialism in the popular imagination, the black turtlenecks, the cigarettes, the cafes full of young people affecting despair as a kind of fashion, an unusually optimistic philosopher in his own strange register, and he grew irritated in the years after the war at how thoroughly his ideas had been misread as a doctrine of paralysis or nihilism. In the lecture that became Existentialism is a Humanism, delivered in Paris in October of 1945 before an audience so large that people reportedly fainted in the crush at the door, he tried explicitly to correct the record. Existentialism, he insisted, was not a philosophy of quietism or despair. It was, if anything, the only philosophy that took human dignity seriously enough to hand a person the entire weight of her own life, rather than distributing that weight across gods, essences, and inherited natures that did the deciding for her in advance. The key concept he reached for, in trying to move past mere anguish towards something livable, was engagement, commitment, action, the choosing of a project and the throwing of oneself into it. Freedom, for Sartre, was never meant to be contemplated indefinitely from a safe distance, the way Mara had been contemplating her spreadsheet. Freedom was meant to be exercised. It only became real, only took on any content at all, at the moment a person acted, chose a path, however imperfectly, and then, crucially, took responsibility for having chosen it, rather than disowning the choice the instant its consequences turned out to be less than perfect. A person who chooses and then spends the rest of her life second-guessing the choice, treating it as something that happened to her rather than something she did, has not actually stepped out of bad faith at all. She has simply relocated the waiter's performance to a later scene. There is a phrase Sartre used that Mara would later write on an index card and keep taped to the inside of a kitchen cabinet, where she would see it every time she reached for a mug on the choice it passe d'être libre on l'est. Condamné à l'être. One does not choose to be free, one is free. Condemned to be it. But there was a second half to his thinking that the popular caricature of existentialism tended to drop, and it was this second half that finally reached her on the 15th day, sitting at her desk with the cursor still hovering. Sartre did not believe freedom was formless or without a shape a person could give it meaning through. He believed that a person becomes who she is only through what she does with her freedom, that character is not discovered sitting somewhere inside you waiting to be found, but built action by action, the way a sculptor does not discover a shape hiding inside a block of stone so much as make one, choice by choice of the chisel, none of which were dictated in advance by the stone itself. This refrained, for Mara, the entire agony of the three folders. She had been treating the decision as an act of discovery, as though there existed, somewhere, a correct answer to the question of who Mara Ashford truly was and what she truly wanted, and her job was simply to excavate it carefully enough, examine enough spreadsheets, ask enough professors, until the true self revealed itself and made the decision on her behalf. But there was no such self waiting to be found. There was only the self she would make, retroactively, through whichever door she walked through, and this, far from being a further burden, turned out, once she sat with it, to loosen something in her chest that had been tight for 2 weeks. If there was no hidden correct answer, then she was not at risk of failing to find one. There was nothing to fail to find. There was only a threshold to step over, and a person on the other side of it who would, by the act of stepping, become someone slightly different than the person deliberating on this side, not a better or truer Mara, just the Mara who had chosen, as opposed to the Mara who was still, at this very moment, choosing not to. She thought about the satisficer and the maximizer again, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, like a held breath finally released, that Schwartz's practical advice and Sartre's philosophical claim were, in the end, pointing at the same door from 2 different hallways. Schwartz would have told her, set your criteria, find the option that clears them, and stop shopping, because the shopping itself is where the damage happens. Sartre would have told her, there is no essence waiting at the bottom of more research to justify your choice in advance, so stop treating the decision as a problem of insufficient data and start treating it as what it actually is, an act, something you do rather than something you eventually, correctly deduce. Both men, separated by discipline and decades, were converging on the same unglamorous instruction: the paralysis is not a symptom of the decision being too hard. It is a symptom of refusing to let the decision be a decision, an act with your name on it, uncushioned by certainty, made anyway. She did not, that night, choose Portland or stay or any configuration involving Daniel with the clean dramatic finality of a film. What she did instead was smaller and, she would come to think, more honest. She wrote down, on a single page, the 3 or 4 things that actually mattered to her, not everything that could conceivably matter, the way her spreadsheet had tried to account for everything, but the handful of things that, if she was truthful with herself, were actually load-bearing. Whether she would still be doing work in 5 years that felt like building something rather than managing something. Whether she wanted the next chapter of her life to be legible to her the way the last decade had been, or whether some active, hungry part of her wanted the productive discomfort of not knowing anyone, of starting over in a language of new streets. Whether Daniel was a reason to choose a city, or whether she had been quietly using him as a fourth folder, a way of avoiding the two-way decision by turning it into an impossible three-way one. The page took 40 minutes to write and, when she read it back, told her almost nothing she hadn't already known on day 1, buried under 13 days of increasingly sophisticated avoidance. That, too, she recognized as part of the lesson. The information had never really been the obstacle. Sartre would have said, flatly, that no further information was coming, that none had ever been coming, that the entire 2 weeks of research and comparison had been, at bottom, an elaborate wait for a permission slip that no authority in the universe was authorized to issue. The permission slip did not exist. There was only her, at a desk at 11 at night, with a page in front of her and a cursor on the screen, condemned, in Sartre's old unforgiving word, to be the only signature the decision would ever get. There is a companion to Sartre's account of freedom that he himself leaned on more than he always credited, developed by the woman who had been his closest interlocutor since they were both young philosophy students at the École Normale Supérieure, arguing through the Luxembourg Gardens about les mis and contingency until the light gave out. Simone de Beauvoir did not simply popularize Sartre's ideas for a wider audience, as some early accounts of the two of them liked to suggest. She built, alongside him and often ahead of him, an ethics that took his account of radical freedom somewhere he had not fully gone himself, into the question of what a person owes to the freedom of others and what it means to choose inside a life that is never, in fact, lived alone. Beauvoir's own book on the subject, The Ethics of Ambiguity, published a few years after the war, took issue gently but firmly with any reading of existentialism that made freedom sound like a purely private affair, one consciousness alone at the edge of its own cliff, answerable to no one but itself. She agreed with Sartre that no essence precedes existence, that no God or nature hands down in advance the content of a life. But she pressed further into a fact Sartre's early writing had a tendency to underplay, that a person's freedom is always, in practice, entangled with the freedom of the people around her, that choosing is rarely the clean, isolated act of the man alone on the cliff, but something closer to a negotiation, ongoing, between one's own project and the projects of everyone whose life brushes against it. To choose for oneself while genuinely indifferent to what that choice does to another person's freedom was not, for Beauvoir, an expression of authentic existentialist commitment. It was closer to what she called seriousness, a different, subtler form of bad faith, in which a person hides from the ambiguity of shared life behind the fiction that her freedom operates in a sealed private chamber with no windows onto anyone else's. This mattered for Mara in a way none of the earlier reading quite had, because the decision in front of her had never actually been the clean, solitary cliff edge of the parable about the young man and his mother, however useful that parable had been for cracking open the shape of her paralysis. Daniel's freedom was tangled into her own the moment his sentence, "I think I want to build something real with you," had entered the room, and pretending otherwise, treating him as a fourth folder to be weighed alongside a city and a job title as though he were an object with the same category of stakes, had been its own quiet failure of the ambiguity Beauvoir was describing. He was not a variable in her equation. He was a second, separate freedom, standing at his own edge, over which she had no authority and to which she owed something more honest than inclusion in a spreadsheet. Beauvoir's answer to this tangle was not to dissolve individual freedom into some warm, blurred collective will, the comforting idea that two people in love simply want the same thing and the friction disappears. She thought that fantasy was its own kind of bad faith, a way of refusing the real, sometimes painful work of two freedoms trying to build something together without either one collapsing into the other's shadow. Her ethics asks instead that a person will her own freedom while also willing the freedom of those bound up with her, an uncomfortable double commitment, because it meant that the easy, self-contained version of authenticity, the one where you simply consult your own wants and act, was not actually available to anyone living in relation to other people, which was to say, not available to anyone at all. When Mara had finally called Daniel, on the evening she chose Portland, she had gone into the conversation half expecting it to feel like an ending, the closing of the folder she'd been most afraid to open, the one whose contents were not a job title or a zip code but another human being's hope. What she found instead, once she actually said the words out loud rather than simulating the conversation in a spreadsheet cell, was that the choice had not required his freedom to bend to hers, nor hers to bend to his, in the tidy way she'd been imagining for 2 weeks whenever she'd tried to solve for both of them simultaneously, as though there existed some single correct configuration that honored both freedoms at once without either of them risking anything. There was no such configuration. There was only the conversation itself, two people, each choosing, in view of the other, neither one authoring the other's answer, which turned out to be a far less symmetrical, far less resolved thing than she had wanted, and also, she came to think later, a far more honest one than the imaginary tidy version could ever have been. Beauvoir would not have promised her that this made the decision painless. She was explicit, throughout her work, that ambiguity was not a problem to be solved but a condition to be lived inside permanently, the way Sartre's anguish was not a phase to be gotten through on the way to some later, freedom-free comfort. The ambiguity was that Mara's freedom and Daniel's freedom could not be fully reconciled by any formula, that choosing for herself would always, to some degree, act upon him without his consent, the way his choosing would always act upon her, and that the only honest response to this was not to pretend the entanglement away in either direction, but to keep choosing inside it, openly answerable to him without being ruled by him, exactly as she remained answerable to herself without being able to hide behind him either. It was a harder, less tidy freedom than the one in the parable about the young man and his mother, precisely because it had two people standing at the edge instead of one, each capable of seeing the other's vertigo and neither one able to descend it on the other's behalf. The morning she finally opened the folders, nothing about the room announced itself as significant. There was no gathering light, no soundtrack swelling underneath the moment the way it might in the version of this story told for an audience rather than lived by a single tired woman at a kitchen table. There was a chipped mug of coffee going lukewarm at her elbow. There was a radiator ticking somewhere in the wall, the ordinary domestic percussion of an old building waking up. There was the low hum of the refrigerator, the same refrigerator that had, 3 weeks earlier, held 43 varieties of yogurt reduced now, mercifully, to 2. She noticed, opening stay first, that her hand did not shake. She had expected, after 2 weeks of anticipating this exact motion, that the moment would carry some ceremonial weight, that her body would register it as the crossing of a threshold. It did not. It felt, instead, almost embarrassingly ordinary, a folder opening the way any folder opens, documents unspoiling onto the screen, an offer letter she had already read 4 times, numbers she already knew by heart. The anticlimax of it was, in its own way, instructive. She had spent 2 weeks treating the decision as though it were a single vast door she would have to summon some extraordinary reserve of courage to walk through, and what she found, in practice, was a Tuesday morning, a lukewarm coffee, and her own 2 hands doing an unremarkable, mechanical thing they had done 10,000 times before, opening a file. She opened Portland next, and then, last, the folder with Daniel's name on it, which held nothing so tidy as documents, only a handful of screenshots of old conversations she had saved for reasons she could no longer entirely reconstruct, evidence of a version of herself who had apparently known, even in the middle of the worst of the paralysis, that this folder was never actually a fourth city to weigh against the other 2, but something else entirely, something that did not belong on the same axis as a job offer, however much easier it had been for 2 exhausting weeks to pretend otherwise. She sat with all 3 windows open on the screen at once for the first time in 15 days, letting herself look at the whole shape of the decision without flinching away from any one part of it, and she thought, not for the first time, about the young man in Sartre's story standing at the base of 2 roads with no sign posted at either one. She understood, finally, sitting there, that she had been waiting all along for the sign, for some external confirmation, arriving from a book or a professor or a boyfriend or a spreadsheet, that would tell her which door had her name already written above it. And she understood, in the same breath, that the waiting itself had been the choice, cast quietly, day after day, for the door marked stay, simply because staying required nothing further of her, no signature, no leap, only the continuation of what already was. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a person in the instant just before an old, familiar form of avoidance loses its grip, not peace, not yet, but the recognizable quiet of a machine finally running out of the fuel that had been driving it. Mara felt that stillness at the kitchen table, coffee gone properly cold now, radiator still ticking, and understood that whatever she chose in the next 5 minutes would not be handed to her from outside. It would be authored plainly by her in a kitchen that would either remain hers or become, soon, someone else's, and that the authoring, however small and undramatic it looked from the outside, was the entire substance of the freedom she had spent 2 weeks trying to outsource to a document. She chose Portland. It would be tidy to say she chose it because the page told her to, but the page had not told her anything so simple as that. It had only cleared enough of the fog for her to notice that she had, in fact, already been leaning that direction for days, and that the spreadsheet, with its careful columns and adjusted salaries, had functioned less as a tool for finding the answer and more as a delaying mechanism dressed up as diligence, keeping her from having to feel the weight of an answer she already, quietly, half knew. What the page gave her was not new information. It gave her the plain sight of her own leaning, unobscured for the first time by 43 varieties of yogurt grade comparison. She told Alvaro the next morning in his office, and watched him take the news with the particular grace of a person who is disappointed and glad for you in the same breath, which is its own small, underrated kind of love between colleagues. She called Daniel the evening, not to end things, because ending things had never actually been decided, only left, like everything else, in an unopened folder, and told him what she'd chosen, and asked, with a directness that startled her a little, whether he wanted to talk about what that could mean for the shape of them going forward, together or apart or in some third configuration neither of them had a name for yet. What she noticed, in the days after, was not relief exactly, though there was relief in it. It was something closer to what Sartre had described, almost offhandedly, in a later interview, when he was asked whether the freedom he'd spent a lifetime writing about ever stopped feeling like a burden. He said that it did not stop, not entirely, but that the character of the weight changed once you were moving under it rather than standing still beneath it. The difference, he said, between a backpack that crushes you while you stand paralyzed at the trailhead, wondering whether this is really the right trail, and the same backpack once you are 3 miles in, breathing hard, going somewhere. The weight had not changed. What had changed was that it was now the weight of a life being lived rather than the weight of a life being endlessly, exhaustingly deliberated. Sartre himself had gone on, after the war, to live inside his own doctrine in ways that were not always comfortable and not always, by his own later admission, correct. He committed himself, loudly and repeatedly, to political causes. He supported the Algerian independence movement at real personal risk. His apartment was bombed twice by opponents of Algerian independence. He aligned himself, controversially and in ways that damaged his reputation for decades, with Soviet communism, visiting the USSR and defending positions he would later, quietly, walk back. He turned down the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1964 on the grounds that a writer who accepted such institutional honors risked becoming an institution himself rather than remaining a free, engaged individual answerable only to his own choices, a decision that was, whatever else you made of it, a piece of theatre almost too perfectly Sartrean to be believed, a man refusing a prize specifically so as not to become the kind of solid, finished object his own philosophy warned against becoming. He was not, in other words, a man who got everything right once he stepped out of the barn near Trier and into a life of engagement. Some of his political commitments look, in hindsight, like serious errors of judgment defended past the point where the evidence justified them, a reminder that Sartre's freedom was never a guarantee of correctness, only a guarantee of authorship. He did not believe that choosing, and committing, and acting in the world protected a person from being wrong. He believed the opposite, in fact, that a person who never commits, who keeps every option permanently open in the name of avoiding error, has not thereby avoided being wrong. She has simply avoided being anything at all, has kept herself indefinitely in the condition of the waiter with the tray, forever rehearsing a life instead of living one. There is a passage, late in Existentialism is as Humanism, where Sartre tries to describe what a life inside this kind of freedom actually feels like from within, once the initial vertigo of the cliff edge has passed, not a life free of anguish, because he never promised that, but a life in which the anguish has been folded into the texture of ordinary action rather than experienced as a paralyzing event that precedes it. A painter, he says, does not know in advance what painting she is going to make. There is no picture floating in some Platonic elsewhere, waiting to be copied down correctly or incorrectly onto the canvas. The picture comes into being through the act of painting itself, brushstroke authorizing brushstroke, the artist discovering, in the act, what she was capable of wanting all along, and it would be absurd, Sartre says, to accuse such a painter of having failed to consult the correct painting before beginning. There was no correct painting. There was only the one she made, and the responsibility, entirely hers, for having made it this way rather than some other way, and the further freedom, always available to her, to pick up the brush again tomorrow and paint something else. Mara thought of this months later, unpacking boxes in an apartment 3 time zones from the one she'd left, on a street she did not yet know the sound of at night, in a city where she knew, at first, almost no one. It was not the version of her life she would have designed on paper if you had asked her, at 22, to draw the blueprint. It was not obviously better than the version where she'd taken the directorship and stayed in the apartment she knew the way you know an old friend's face. It came, as every choice does, with its own permanent, uncollectible debt to the roads not taken. She would, she suspected, spend a portion of every year for the rest of her life wondering, in an idle, unthreatening way, about the woman who had stayed. But she noticed, unpacking the last box, that the wondering had a different texture now than the anguish of the 3 folders had, quieter, more like the ordinary bittersweetness of having lived one life instead of every life, which was, she understood now, the only kind of life any human being had ever actually been offered in occupied Paris or a supermarket aisle or anywhere else freedom had ever been condemned to exist. Nobody knows, to this day, what the young man decided, whether he crossed into unoccupied territory to fight or stayed with his mother in the narrowed, dangerous quiet of occupied Paris. Sartre never named him, and in later tellings of the story even Sartre's account of what advice he gave shifted slightly, softened or sharpened depending on the audience, so that some biographers have wondered whether the young man was even a single real person or a composite Sartre built to make his argument breathe. It hardly matters in the end which it was. The not knowing is, in its own way, the most honest part of the story, because the whole point Sartre was making was that no one, not even the philosopher telling the tale, gets to see how it turns out for someone else, gets to hand down a verdict from outside the choosing. The story ends exactly where it should end, at the threshold, with the young man free and alone, and about to become, through whatever he did next, a particular kind of person that neither Sartre nor history nor the young man himself could have specified in advance. There is a temptation, hearing a story like this, to want it resolved, to want to know he chose well or chose badly, so that the tale can be filed away as a lesson with a clean moral at the bottom, the way a fable ends with the fox learning something about grapes. But Sartre's whole philosophy was, in a sense, a refusal of that kind of tidiness. He was not offering a system that told you in advance what the right choice would be in any given circumstance. He was offering something both smaller and larger than that, the insistence that the choosing itself, undertaken honestly, in full awareness of its weight, was the only form of integrity available to a creature with no essence handed down from above. He was not interested in whether the young man joined the resistance or stayed with his mother. He was interested in whether the young man, having chosen, stood behind the choice, claimed it, lived inside it, refused to disown it later as something that had merely happened to him. This is perhaps the least comfortable and most useful thing Sartre has to offer someone standing, as Mara once stood, in front of 43 yogurts or 3 unopened folders or any of the 1,000 smaller thresholds an ordinary life in an age of abundance keeps generating faster than any single nervous system evolved to cross a savanna with a handful of live options was ever built to metabolize. It is not a formula for finding the correct choice, because Sartre did not believe a correct choice, in the sense of one verified in advance by some authority outside the chooser, existed to be found. It is, instead, something closer to a permission, the permission to stop treating every decision as a research problem awaiting sufficient data, and to start treating it as what Sartre insisted it always secretly was, an act of authorship, undertaken by a person who will become, through the act, someone slightly different than she was the moment before, for better and for worse, and who will then have the further freedom, always to keep authoring, choice after choice, for as long as she is alive to make them. Barry Schwartz, in the closing pages of his own book, arrives at something that rhymes with this, from an entirely different direction, using the vocabulary of psychology rather than phenomenology. He does not tell his readers to seek out fewer options in some general, monastic way, renouncing the modern world's abundance wholesale. He suggests something more modest and, in its way, more demanding, learning to recognize the difference between decisions that deserve the full weight of maximizing effort, the handful of genuinely large, structural choices in a life, a marriage, a career, a home, and the 100 smaller decisions each day that do not, and do not need to, and are actively harmed by receiving that same exhaustive treatment. He suggests, in effect, budgeting deliberation, the way a person budgets money, not infinitely, not according to the size of the want in the moment, but according to a considered sense of what actually merits the expense. Choosing a yogurt and choosing a city are not, whatever the nervous systems and discriminating panic might suggest at 11 at night with a laptop open, decisions that deserve the same 14 days. And there is a final piece of Schwartz's argument that sits, unexpectedly, very close to Sartre's insistence on commitment, on engagement, on standing behind a choice once made rather than treating it as provisional forever. Schwartz found, across the research he surveyed, that satisfaction with a decision correlates less with the objective quality of the options selected than with the chooser's relationship to the choice after the fact, whether she continues to hold the door open, mentally, to every alternative she declined, or whether she is able, at some point, to close the door, not out of denial, but out of a kind of active, ongoing loyalty to the path she is now actually walking. The people who reported the most lasting satisfaction in his studies were not the ones who had somehow, through superior analysis, found the single best available option. They were the ones who, having chosen, stopped auditioning the alternatives and began, instead, investing in the choice itself, treating a good enough decision, tended and committed to, as something that could become, over time, through the accumulating weight of that commitment, genuinely excellent, in a way that no amount of pre-decision comparison shopping could have guaranteed from the outset. This, in the end, is where the two threads of this story, a philosopher in an occupied city discovering the unbearable heaviness of a freedom he could not decline, and a woman in an age of digital abundance discovering the same heaviness dressed in a costume of consumer choice, finally meet, if they were ever really two threads at all rather than one viewed at different magnifications. Sartre stood in the ruins of a collapsed moral order and found freedom terrifying precisely because nothing was there to catch him. Every value he might have leaned on had been shown, by the catastrophe around him, to be optional, chosen, unguaranteed. Mara stood in a supermarket aisle, catching, at the outer edge of prosperity and abundance, an echo of that same vertigo, not because too little had been given to her, but because too much had, until the sheer plurality of good options began to function in her nervous system with an uncanny resemblance to no options at all. Different centuries, different hemispheres, a war and a yogurt aisle, and underneath both of them the same fact, patient and indifferent to the scale of the decision it governed, that a conscious creature with no fixed essence is always, in every circumstance, the sole author of what she does next, and that this authorship cannot be outsourced, deferred, or waited out, only exercised or avoided, and that avoiding it, however comfortable the costume, is itself, quietly, an act of the very authorship it pretends to escape. Mara kept the index card taped inside the kitchen cabinet in the new apartment, the one with Sartre's line about being condemned to freedom, and beside it, over time, she taped a second card, in her own handwriting, that said something closer to Schwartz, a note to herself about the difference between the decisions that deserved 14 days and the ones that deserved 14 seconds, and a reminder for the mornings when the old paralysis crept back in over something as small as which of two open jobs to answer first, or which of two friends to call back, that the feeling in her chest was not a sign she had insufficient information. It was only ever a sign that she had arrived again at the edge of a freedom she had never actually been able to decline, standing there the way she always had, the way the young man had in the winter of the occupation, the way anyone does who has ever looked at more than one good road and understood, with something between horror and a strange, hard-won kind of dignity, that the choosing was hers, unaided, uncushioned, and entirely, irreducibly her own to make. She still, on certain evenings, finds herself standing a beat too long in front of a shelf of something ordinary coffee, now in the new city, 40 kinds of it, whole bean and ground and single origin and blended, arranged with the same seductive paralyzing abundance as the yogurt once was, 4,000 miles away in a life she no longer lives. But the beat is shorter now. She has learned to notice the particular flavor of the hesitation, to recognize it for what it is rather than what it dresses itself up as, and more often than not, these days, she reaches for whichever bag is nearest to her hand, pays, and walks out into whatever the evening happens to be doing, free, in the only sense the word has ever actually meant, condemned to it, and, increasingly, at peace with the sentence.